Okay, so now we are going to look at the approaches in psychology. So this would normally be in paper 2. This would normally be a 24 mark or half an hour section at the start of paper 2, but this will be a 24 mark and half an hour section in your end of year exam. So this is the spec for approaches. You'll notice there's some names of researchers in here. It means you need to know those researchers, you need to know what they did, and you could be asked to refer to what they did without any context, or the question might refer to them by name. So within approaches, you've got Wundt, you've got Pavlov and Skinner, and Bandura and Maslow. So these are names that you need to know. You definitely need to know the research that these people did. So it's these names that are important. So this is where this is how the approaches sit with each other. This is how they've evolved kind of over time, and this is the approaches kind of chronologically. So you've got Wundt, and then you've got Freud and psychodynamic approach, then the behaviorist approach, then Maslow with humanism, cognitive approach, biological approach, and then cognitive neuroscience. So just basic summary. So the psychodynamic approach is about childhood trauma or conflict. The behavioral approach is about conditioning. The cognitive approach is about thinking. The biological approach is about genes and the brain. And the humanistic approach is about free will and about the person as a whole. So if we start with Wundt, so he started off psychology. He published the first textbook on psychology. He did the first investigations into psychology using a approach known as structuralism, so breaking down behaviors into basic elements. So Wundt carried out kind of his research using structuralism. He used a technique called introspection, which is about looking into, so people reflecting on their own thoughts and being asked to describe their own thoughts and mental processes. So that is introspection. It doesn't seem that scientific, but it's still used today. So you've still got a concept called thinking aloud that uses introspection. Wundt established psychology as a science by using a scientific method. He based his work on two assumptions: that all behavior is caused by something, so it's determined by something, and then if behavior is determined, then you should be able to predict how new behavior would occur, so it's predictability. So Wundt used these two assumptions of the fact that things are determined and the fact that behavior is predictable, and this became the start of a scientific method. So that's why Wundt is important to psychology. This is the scientific method, so it's about questioning and hypothesizing and experimenting and so on. But this is where it started. So the scientific method came from Wundt and his experiments using introspection, looking at structuralist ideas. Then you have the psychodynamic approach. So the psychodynamic approach is Freud. Freud's name isn't on the spec, but the psychodynamic approach is. So Freud was a trained neurologist, and is kind of the psychologist that's credited for the psychodynamic approach. The key assumptions of the approach is our behavior is due to unconscious processes, that our personality is made up of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego, and that our early childhood experiences will determine our adult personality. So the unconscious, that's a really important thing in terms of the psychodynamic approach, and our unconscious mind will determine our behavior. So there's a lack of free will here. It's the fact that our unconscious mind is determining our behavior, and that's a form of determinism known as psychic determinism. The psychodynamic approach looked at your personality using kind of the metaphor of an iceberg, but you've got the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is in our unconscious, and only parts of our ego and superego are in our conscious, thought. Freud argued that we could access the unconscious through different methods. One of those was dream analysis. So our dreams could demonstrate what we were actually thinking through the latent and manifest content. We could also use free association. So that's where you are encouraged to relax and just say what kind of comes into your head. and that's where you might get a slip of the tongue or a Freudian slip that might demonstrate what you're really thinking. And then you might get projective tests like the ink blot test, which your interpretation of a certain stimuli would mean a therapist could tell you what you were actually thinking. So Freud is looking at the unconscious. He's also looking at the fact that our personality is a tripartite structure. So it's made of three parts, the id, the ego, and the superego. And the three parts are constantly kind of in dispute with one another. And you're constantly trying to kind of rationalize these three aspects of your personality. The id is kind of your pleasure principle. That's your primitive part of your personality. It's in the unconscious, and that is formed early on in the stages of psychosexual development, and it operates using this pleasure principle. So if you want stuff, you go and take it. So it's formed in the oral stage. The ego is formed in the anal stage, so that is kind of your reality principle. It's the thing that tries to control your id and your superego. And your superego is kind of your conscious, your kind of Jiminy Cricket, your ideal sense. And this is formed in the phallic stage through the Oedipus or the Electra complex when you internalize your morals. So you've got your id, your ego, and your superego. There is a balance between your id and your superego because you have this intrapsychic conflict. So this is a conflict you are unaware of between components of your personality, and this can lead to anxiety. Freud argues that our ego uses things called ego defense mechanisms to try to establish a balance between the id and the superego. So ego defense mechanisms are used to try and control this intrapsychic conflict that we have. So these defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies and can include repression, denial, and displacement. Now, there are other defense mechanisms, but please try to just use these three. Also, try to remember that students tend to forget about defense mechanisms. It tends to be a bit of the psychodynamic approach that they forget. And because of this, it's a bit that AQA like to ask questions on. So your defense mechanisms are kind of strategies that you use to try to control your intrapsychic conflict. So that's repression, denial, and displacement. So repression is where you force a memory out of your conscious mind. Denial is kind of refusing to acknowledge an aspect of reality. And displacement is where you move an emotion from a source of anxiety onto something else. And that's the transference of a feeling or an emotion. So there's some examples on the screen there of the three defense mechanisms. Again, there's other types that are named in other textbooks, but please just learn these three. The next assumption of the psychodynamic approach is that our early childhood experiences are very important in our adult lives. Events that occur in childhood can affect our personalities when we are older. And Freud proposed that all children go through the same stages of development. He referred to them as the psychosexual stages. So there's these 5 psychosexual stages of development that we all go through. They are age dependent. They have a kind of activity or kind of something that energy is focused on, and each stage requires kind of a resolution of a particular conflict or task. It's about your libido, it's about your sexual energy moving between each of the stages, and if you fail to kind of complete or fail to resolve the conflict in each of the stages, you can be fixated at that stage, and that's where you leave some of your libido in that stage. And it can cause problems later on. It's important that you know the psychosexual stages. It's important that you know the order of them and you know the names of them. So the 5 stages are oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. Learn the order, learn the names, and roughly learn the ages. I use an acronym to remember the order, which is old, age, pensioners, love, Guinness. And that helps me remember the order that they go in. But please remember the names and please remember the orders of those stages. So at each stage, you could be fixated or you could be stuck at a stage. So the first stage is the oral stage. The mouth is the source of pleasure. You may be fixated on this stage if you are under or overfed as a baby. The anal stage is about potty training, and it's about pleasure from potty training. But you could become fixated at this stage either by potty training that's too harsh or kind of too relaxed. You could become anally retentive or anally expulsive. So you could become kind of obsessively tidy, and that's anally retentive because your toilet training has been too harsh, or anally expulsive. So, for example, you might be untidy or bad with money because your toilet training has been too relaxed. The phallic stage is to do with the penis. It's where you get this Oedipus complex. So this is where boys will develop an association with their same-sex parent because of feelings they have towards a mother that they can't resolve. In this stage, boys will develop castration anxiety, so they will be worried that they will lose their penis. And that's why further reason why they will identify with their father, and then their dad, his morals become kind of their super ego. The alternative for this for women is the Electra complex, but women will not have castration anxiety, but they will have penis envy, so they will think that they have already been castrated as a form of punishment. So this is all in the phallic stage. So that's just the Oedipus complex. There is a link here with social learning theory about identification with the same-sex role model. It just happens for different reasons. The next stage is a latent stage where nothing happens. And then you have the genital stage, which is a focus on the genitals and a focus on kind of having sex as a way to satisfying the libido. So Freud argues that you need to pass through each stage, and if you don't, you will be fixated in that stage, and then that can cause some behaviours later on in adulthood. So, for example, a fixation in the oral stage could cause smoking or overeating when you are older. Freud also looks at different types of therapy. So psychoanalysis is a form of therapy which is cathartic, so it's the release of kind of unconscious or pent-up kind of tensions. And this is just a summary of the psychodynamic approach and the different points of it. If you're evaluating the psychodynamic approach, there are strengths and weaknesses. Please don't just focus on the weaknesses. That is easier to do. It's unscientific. It is psychic determinism. There's an alpha gender bias here. There are strengths to the psychodynamic approach. It's very influential. It's very pioneering. It does make some sense. As I said, there is a link to social learning theory and identification of a same-sex parent, and it does have some explanatory power. And it is used as therapy. So please make sure that you look at both the strengths and the weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach if you are evaluating. There is a gender bias, so that's a nice evaluation point that you can use when you're talking about these psychodynamic approaches. An alpha gender bias, it's this assuming that men are better, penis envy, castration anxiety. That is an example of how you could write it as an evaluation paragraph. There's also culture bias. Freud's research is Western or has kind of an imposed ethic from a Western culture. You can also evaluate the psychodynamic approach in terms of the fact that it's not that scientific, so it's fairly subjective. It's not empirical and it's not reliable. So Freud does not hit these features of science. So his is more subjective, it's more anecdotal, and it is unreliable. So this can be used as a weakness of the psychodynamic approach. And this is just how you might want to write it up as an evaluation point. As I said, though, not just weaknesses. Please focus on the strengths. Therapy is a good example of a use of the psychodynamic approach. The next approach is behaviorism. In terms of debates, reductionism, nature, nurture, and free will and determinism are all really useful when you are evaluating this approach. The behaviourist assumptions are that learning is something that's observable, it's something that can be measured, and it uses the concept of classical and operant conditioning, so learning through association and learning through rewards and costs. And this is kind of a timeline of behaviorism, just to show you kind of how behaviorism sits in kind of a chronological fashion. So classical conditioning is the first concept in behaviorism, so that's association between two stimuli. Pavlov's research is the famous research here in terms of classical conditioning of his dogs. And it's just a reminder of Pavlov's research. Remember, Pavlov's named on the spec, so you might be asked about what he did or what he found out. So in Pavlov, it's classical conditioning, it's learning through association. There is a human example of classical conditioning, which is Watson and Rayner's study on little Albert. This is about how we might learn a phobia or how we might learn unhelpful or maladaptive behaviour. So this can be used for behaviourism. It can also be used next year for psychopathology as well in terms of phobias. So Albert was just conditioned to be scared of rats and white fluffy things. Operant conditioning, so that's Skinner. So that's where we're looking at reinforcement and punishment. So he used Skinner's box. It works on the fact that reinforcement will increase the likelihood of a behaviour occurring, and that punishment will decrease the likelihood of a behaviour occurring again. So there's different types of reinforcement and punishment. You can get positive and negative. So Skinner is saying that learning is an active process that can use positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. He used Skinner's box to demonstrate the principles of operant conditioning. Again, he's named on the spec, so you might need to describe what he did or what he found out. And just a reminder, there's a difference between positive and negative reinforcement. You also have schedules of reinforcement. So it's the idea that you don't reinforce a behaviour every time it occurs. You can partially reinforce, or you can use different schedules of reinforcement. So partial reinforcement tends to lead to stronger behaviours. So you can either use continuous reinforcement or partial reinforcement. Make sure you know the difference between the two. One application of behaviorism is token economies. So these can be used to reward certain behaviours. It could be something as simple as kind of a sticker chart for tidying a room. It could be something that is used to monitor positive behaviour, for example, in a prison. So that's a token economy. These are just some examples of how you might elaborate on evaluation paragraphs for behaviorism essays, or essays where you are asked to look at the contribution of behaviourist psychologists. These just follow the Berger format of tutor to you. So just some examples of elaborated paragraphs. These are all available online if you want some help structuring a longer answer. So if you get a 16-mark question and you want some help structuring a longer answer. In terms of evaluating the approach, you've got positive evaluation points on the left, and some negative evaluation points on the right. Remember, behaviourists argue that animals and humans are equal, so findings in animals can be related to humans equally. The next approach is another learning approach. It's social learning theory. It works on the basic assumptions that our behaviour is learned from our environment and learnt from observing other people. We look at vicarious learning, so learning through others. Modelling is about observing and imitating the behaviours of a role model. Identification is feeling like you are similar with someone that you are observing. And a mediational process, a very important concept, something that students tend to forget. A mediational process is the cognitive process by which you decide whether you will imitate the behaviour that you have observed in your role model. Modeling is kind of the imitation and kind of replication of a behavior. Bandura argued that we will learn vicariously. We will learn through kind of watching other people and seeing the results of their actions. And he did investigate this using kind of the famous Bobo doll experiment. So Bandura is looking at whether children imitate aggression, and he's got children watching this video, and he found that from the different groups of children, so if they watched an aggressive model or a non-aggressive model, and that model was the same or different gender to them, the children would imitate the aggression. So these slides just go through the procedure and the findings of Bandura. So remember, Bandura is an example of social learning theory. The concept of social learning theory, though, is this kind of these mediational processes. And I use the acronym of ARM to remember what they are. So it's attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. In terms of evaluating behaviorism, so there's lots of research support. However, it tends to lack ecological validity because research tends to be carried out in a lab. Operant conditioning, again, there's lots of real-life examples, but it does ignore the role of internal factors, so it's environmentally reductionist. It ignores kind of internal things. And in terms of social learning theory, modelling tends to occur in children. However, it doesn't explain a lot of behaviour, such as the acquisition of language. You can argue that social learning theory is more holistic than operant or classical conditioning because it does include the mediational processes. So there is a cognitive element that the other parts of the approach do not have. Nature-nurture, reductionism, and determinism are issues and debates that you can use for behaviorism and social learning theory. The next approach is humanism. So humanism was meant to be less deterministic and less artificial and more positive than the approaches that had come beforehand. It worked on the basic principles that we're all good and we're all valued and we choose to grow and we are different to animals. It also is the only approach that's not deterministic. It heavily involves free will. So we make choices, we make decisions as to what we are doing. So this is different than the other approaches. Maslow is a very important psychologist. Here he is here. He did a lot of research into the humanistic approach, and we specifically need to look at his hierarchy of needs. So Maslow developed this hierarchy of needs, which looked at kind of human motivating factors. So you've got needs that go from physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. You need to know Maslow's hierarchy. Maslow is named on the spec. You need to know an example of each of the steps and kind of what this shows. So we all want to self-actualize. We all want to kind of choose to be our best possible person. That's what Maslow is looking at. You've also got Carl Rogers, who did some research into the approach. Rogers is not named on the spec, Maslow is. But Rogers looks at self-worth and self-image. And how we see ourselves and how we want people to see ourselves and how that can potentially affect our behaviours. He looked at unconditional positive regard, so it's kind of liking people with no conditions, with no reasons, and people that receive unconditional positive regard tend to be happier. We also want to reach a state of congruence, which is where who we think we are and who we want to be match up. If we are incongruent, if they do not match, it can lead to unhappiness and an inability to self-actualize. So we have our real self, so how we are in the world. We have our ideal self, kind of who we want to be. And then we have our perceived self, and we kind of want them to match up in order to be congruent. So you want your self-concept to be congruent. And then you are more likely to be happy, you are more likely to be able to self-actualize. In terms of kind of wider applications of humanistic psychology, it's used a lot in therapy, so client-centered therapy, because it's more holistic. So client-centered therapy is a way to try to reduce incongruence in people, try to establish unconditional positive regard, try to look at the problems of setting up conditions of worth where you have kind of judgments on kind of whether you like people or not. We are a fully functioning person if we experience unconditional positive regard, if we do not experience conditions of worth. You can investigate congruence using something called a Q-sort, which is something you can do if you want to. Humanism has its strengths. It emphasizes choice, it emphasizes free will. It's very subjective. It looks at kind of the person. It helps with therapies. However, it's less scientific. It's more qualitative. It's less reliable. It has a cultural bias to it. The next approach is a cognitive approach. So with behaviorism, we just looked at a pure stimulus response thing. With social learning theory, you had stimulus response, but with mediation of processes in the middle. The cognitive approach is about the bit in the middle. It's about information processing and what we do with that information. So the approach is about thinking. It's about our beliefs and how that affects our behavior. It works on the assumption that we need to look at what's going on in terms of people's internal mental processes, how people are thinking, how we can infer that, how we can guess that from how they behave. So it's about how our thinking shapes our behavior. Now, we can't see what people are thinking, so we have to use inference. We have to use a best guess from an observation a lot of the time. But humans are seen as kind of like computers, they're like information processors, and it's looking at how we interpret behavior and how our brains help us make sense of the world. So there's certain mental processes that cognitive psychologists will look at. And as I said, it's about inference. It's about making a best guess. Cognitive psychologists sometimes use theoretical or computer models where it looks at people as information processors, kind of like a computer. So it's about kind of input and output. A good example of theoretical models or computational models are some of the memory models. You can investigate this with schema, with Bartlett's War of the Ghosts. The fact that schema are kind of mental frameworks that we use to make sense of the world, the fact that we can test schema, the fact that we can identify schema. So that's an important part of the cognitive approach. And then you've got this computer analogy where humans are seen to be like computers in terms of trying to investigate behavior. As I said, the memory models are really good examples to use when you're talking about cognitive models. The cognitive approach is scientific. It's an example of soft determinism. So it's fairly deterministic, but you have an aspect of free will because you have this kind of cognitive process. However, it does ignore motivation and it does ignore emotion. So there's some strengths of the cognitive approach there. There's some weaknesses of the cognitive approach. Cognitive psychologists are scientific, so it is looked upon as a science, and there are lots of practical applications of the cognitive approach. This also leads to kind of cognitive neuroscience, which is where you have the cognitive and the biological approaches working together. So we're mainly interested in the use of kind of brain scans, imaging techniques, where instead of making a best guess, instead of inferring what people are thinking, we can actually look in their brain and kind of see what they are thinking. And then your final approach is the biological approach. This looks at kind of genes and structures and how our behavior is shaped by kind of neurochemistry in us. Heredity is an important thing. It's about how we pass information from one generation to another. Those who are kind of believe that everything is inherited are called nativists in terms of psychologists. This links to the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. So obviously the biological approach is nature. There are other approaches such as behaviorism that sit on the nurture side. Psychodynamic is also nature. You need to know the difference between genotypes and phenotypes because it's named on the spec. So genotype is your gene. A phenotype is kind of the expression of a gene. So it's the interaction between your gene and your environment. You should be able to give an example of a genotype and a phenotype. You might be asked questions about it. There's lots of questions about teeth if you look at previous exam questions, but please make sure you know the difference between a genotype and phenotype. Twin studies are sometimes used to investigate the biological approach, because you can look at how much is inherited and how much is to do with our genes. Remember, identical genes are referred to as monozygotic, so MZ twins. Identical twins, sorry, non-identical twins are referred to as dizygotic, so DZ twins. So when you're looking at the biological approach, you might look at twin studies. So MZ twins are identical, DZ are non-identical. You might want to look at evolution as well in terms of the biological approach, in terms of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Here are some evaluation points for the biological approach. So you've got positive and negative evaluation points. Nature-nurture, remember, is a good debate to use for this approach. When we look at the biological approach, we need to look at the brain. You need to be able to label the lobes on the brain, so frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. The brain normally faces this way, so you see the left hemisphere, you see the left side, so the brain is facing the left there. We've also got the nervous system. So you've got your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system is your somatic and your autonomic nervous systems, and those are the divisions of the nervous systems. We'll come back to this in second year biopsychology content. So the nervous system uses different types of nerves. You've got sensory neurons, relay neurons, and motor neurons. Again, it's covered again in year 2 stuff. And messages are sent through synaptic transmission or neurotransmission. And again, we'll look at this next year. Excitation and inhibition are parts of synaptic transmission. The endocrine system is our glands and our hormones and our bloodstream. It's an alternative system than our nervous system. And these are some glands. And again, this is year 2 stuff. The biological approach is scientific, so you can evaluate it in terms of how scientific it is. Reductionism is a good issue and debate to use for the biological approach. Also, the application to real life and cultural differences. And again, cognitive neuroscience is where the cognitive approach and the biological approaches combine. And the last thing you could be asked to do on the spec is to compare the approaches, just to say how they're similar or different, and to explain this similarity. This can be done ideally if you just compare them all together. So there are certain things you compare. So nature-nurture, whether they have any bias, and so on, whether they use animals, whether they are idiographic or nomothetic, and so on. And there is a big table that you can use to compare all of the approaches together. So again, in your exam, this will be half an hour or 24 marks worth of question.